Okay. I suppose I didn't really explain the Gospel of Thomas in any real sense in my weird elaboration of my relationship to Protestantism. And that's something I ought to start with. One moment. So in early Christian writing, I mean like in the writing of who they call like the early Christian fathers, like Clement, Jerome, and whatever, for a long time they had referenced a text called the Gospel of Thomas. But until 1945, no one had ever really had access to it. It was discovered in Egypt in a place called the Nag Hammadi Library, which isn't really a place, but it's the name given to a corpus of texts discovered after World War II in Egypt. That's basically, like, it's all called apocryphal Christianity, which just means it wasn't canonized. But the oldest one, and the one, again, that is the most interesting, is the Gospel of Thomas. The rest of them are a bit more suspect to their relationship to the historical Jesus, and as well, I think just kind of distract from what might be a real historical relationship of Christianity to Eastern religion and philosophy at the time. Like the Gospel of Judas, for instance, I'm fascinated by, but I don't think is as illuminating as the Gospel of Thomas is. So the Gospel of Thomas is technically heretical to the Christian church. And that means, like, it's supposed to represent, like, a line of thinking that isn't orthodox. Like, it's all, like, a logical circle. None of these words really mean much. But there were groups of Christians related to whomever we want to call the Gnostics that used the Gospel of Thomas and held it as just as real as any of the synoptic Gospels. I think that's also just something that needs elaboration, is like when people talk about Christianity, there's no common notion that there was a period of time where like the philosophy around whatever Jesus was had to be worked out. Like, in my understanding of Christianity, Jesus just perfectly elucidated himself when he was living, and whatever confusion I had with whatever was being taught to me was either my fault or I just hadn't read enough, yada, yada, yada. But the confusions that arise within the actual logic of Christianity are solely because it is a historical movement. And, like, it's impossible to see it outside of its relationship to, like, again, a synthesis of ideas in a very specific place and period of time. And that being, again, the Levant, right at the start of the Common Era. Like, we relate that to Christianity, but Christianity is far more related to how the world was becoming globalized at that specific point in time than the other way around. Like, we associate, we call it the Christian world, because the Middle Ages, it became a Christian world. But Christianity arose out of a kind of a logical necessity, in the same way that Buddhism did, and in the same way that Islam did. They all represent the same kind of dialectic relationship to agriculture and to the state. I will elaborate on that further, but I really think, again, the Gospel of Thomas shows this better than the other synoptic Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas begins with the line, "Those who find interpretation to these sayings will not experience death." So it's important to note that the Gospel of Thomas is not a gospel like the other synoptic ones. And by synoptic, I mean Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they call the other one a Johannine gospel. It's not a story of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. It presents itself as a book of sayings. So in that it is formally and structurally the same as the Dhammapada, and much more similarly written to the Tao Te Ching. Sorry. Also, for your ears today, in this one, it is some sort of collection of jazz standards that I don't mind. I usually hate big band jazz, but it's okay. But again, I'm trying to skirt copyright and not paint in the silence. We'll see what happens. Scholars believe that the Gospel of Thomas, they know for a fact, due to carbon dating and like the study of how bookbinding works and whatever, they know it was made before 200 AD, like the actual codex that they have. There are scholars that believe that it might have been written as early as 60 AD, and that's basically a linguistic claim, I believe, due to like some of the sayings and how they're structured. But the point being is that it's as old as, or older than, anything but Mark. And the most radical scholars believing that it is as old as Mark. Which, honestly, upon reading it, the only reason I mean to talk about it at length is because it baffled me. It spoke to me. And I don't even mean that in like a religious sense. Like, there's texts that have been religious that have spoken to me plenty. I keep bringing up the Tao Te Ching. That book has probably been one of the more like actually influential books that I've ever read. Or I wouldn't even call it a book, like pieces of human language. Like, I still read it weekly, just going through it. I really do think there's value in whatever has staying power, like beneath whatever we're ascribing to it historically. There's a reason it sticks in people's minds. And I really think Christianity has lost its notion of why it sticks in people's minds. Anyways. Pardon me. Looking kind of good. Use some copper. I think there is an argument to be made that the economic history of Europe is really the same as its Christian history. I really think it's impossible to separate the Reformation from the development of liberal politics and socialist politics. And like all of the earliest, not all of them, but a lot of the earliest like socialist traditions you get in Europe are straight up just radical Christian takes. I think Augustine is someone who gets kind of forgotten about by the left because really, like, he's a wonderful figure, and his confessions are like a piece of literature that everyone interested in, any sort of alienation, literature about existence, and anyone who really liked Nausea by Sartre, or likes Camus, or likes Dostoevsky should read Augustine. Because I think his confessions are kind of the first in a genre I'll call the sad boy existentialist novel. That's functionally just like a 20-something who's had everything, lived in the pleasure palace. He's disappointed. And he needs to discover what is beneath his wants. Confessions are hilarious because there's a point where Augustine starts talking about becoming addicted to incense. And from someone who's had like legitimate drug problems, it's just like, damn, if only I could just get attached to the smell of the stimulus. Because obviously he was addicted to whatever the incense was attached to. But this is besides the point. He basically was like a scumbag, a hedonistic scumbag of a young man before we had a codified notion of that. And the way that it comes out is hilarious. Rousseau is a similar story. He literally has a Confessions too. And in the Confessions Rousseau talks about going out into the street of Geneva at night and like pulling up his pantaloons so that women can come over and spank him. It's delightful. But it's so naive and like trying to do the same thing as Catcher in the Rye. Like really, like I meant the existential sad boy novel. Like this novel is in every generation, but a lot of times it's not a novel. And in the case of Salinger, it's debatable as to whether or not Catcher in the Rye is really a novel or really an act of therapy. But I mean, all of this has their root in Augustine's Confessions. But the more I read Augustine, the more I was like, this dude's just kind of a communist. And I hope more people who are smarter than me, actually involved in economic theory, maybe take another look at him. Because he was a Manichaean before he was a Christian, which is important to note, because the Manichaeans are more similar to the Neoplatonists or the Gnostics. But he was, again, what I mean to imply then is more of a Zoroastrian tradition, really. Like, it's more of an Eastern tradition. Like, that's so vague. And I don't have quotes right now, like, up above me to tell you what I really mean. But Augustine was rejecting a kind of notion that I mean to suppose. It's hidden in his work. Well, hidden because we have such a modern bullshit notion of Christian thought. But like the symbolism doesn't need to be there. I remember I brought my friend to Easter. I think it was Easter. No, it would have been Black Sunday. Ash Wednesday. It's so goddamn, goodness me. Okay, so listen how hard that is. We got Black Friday is a consumerist ritual. I don't even know what the actual Christian ritual, it's like portmanteau or whatever is. It's horrifying. But I brought him to the service, and he was horrified. He was so scared by all the songs about bleeding lambs and about blood. I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood. I went to a ridiculous amount of bar mitzvahs, honestly. And so I had a lot of Jewish friends, and we were often, just in some lame adolescent cultural exchange. Like, I'll come to your Hanukkah things, you come to decorate my Christmas tree, But I remember so specifically when we went to this one service, he couldn't, all of these songs and these images and motifs that had been buried in me that I had never considered, that we are the Lamb of God and that there's a blood sacrifice revolving around Christianity. I had never really thought about it. And all he could think about was it. I think that's important. Nothing in the Gospel of Thomas is about Jesus dying. It's entirely a book of aphorisms. It has all of the parables, or most of the parables, that are in the New Testament. But again, I think they're in a much purer form. And I would love it if anyone else would read it and tell me if they agree. I really just mean to get people to read this text because I think it's more important and then has been realized and has not really entered the public consciousness. This was probably the greatest archaeological find of the last 100, maybe 1,000 years. Besides maybe finding Troy, but even that, I don't think that I can properly express how important finding this text was, and like how little it is actually, in a scholarly sense, how little it has been clarified. Like I can only attribute it to the, like, and attach it to other things I've read and try to make historical connections, but like there is a history that has been hidden, like literally buried and burned thousands of years ago, that has now been slightly unearthed. That in itself is exciting, but the fact that when you read the text, it talks about things like gender binaries and like the construction of language in a way that the Bible never does, and like economic relationships in like such a clear and like brutal way. The Bible only jokes at these things in symbolism. And I think that's kind of the propagandistic point of the writings of Paul. Or in the development of the canon, whatever we want to call it. Because, again, there wasn't a Christian that, like, the forms of Christianity that we know of in Syria and in, Iraq and Egypt, further away from the Levant, they weren't what we would consider Christian at all. They were far more Zoroastrian, far more like Buddhist minded, even though that wasn't really to draw that comparison is scholarly dishonest. But like the way that they use grammar, the way that they talk about reality, the Gnostic texts, and again, that word is a horrible word in the common understanding, because you're much more likely to go to a music festival and run into a dude with like a goober with dreadlocks who tell you he knows everything about everything and he's a Gnostic, than you are to get a real good scholarly take on what that word actually means historically. And that's the problem with trying to express any of this. I don't mean to sound like a conspiratorial nutcase. I just think there is a large history in Christianity that leftists should examine, and I mean to examine it. The next one, I guess I'll actually give you quotes. I really have too much to say about this, I suppose, but I guess this is art so far. Have a lovely day.